Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, a comparatively young library that sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us this morning for another episode of the Library's Fellows Findings series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks, and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the Library, which is just a very serious way to say that I have the best job here because I get to look after the Library's Fellows. So we have this monthly series where Fellows come online and share with you some in-depth details about what they've been spending their time on here at the library, finding stuff out about our collections that many of the staff here had no idea that we had just sitting downstairs. So if you have any questions of today's speaker, please use the Q&A feature at the top of your screen, and I'll be back in a little while to ask those questions. And today's speaker is, of course, Associate Professor Liz Giuffre of the University of Technology, Sydney. Liz has been an extraordinary addition to the library's fellowships program. She's not only participated in all of the things that we do, but she's actually also been delivering training and sharing some of her research skills with her colleagues here in the Horn Room. So it is terrific to have her here today. And I'm also proud to call her my friend. So it's a very special Tuesday morning here in Library Land. She's going to talk today. I'm not going to give any spoiler alerts. She's going to talk about hidden histories of Australian popular music and culture. And I am not going to say anything more than that. Thanks, Liz.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rachel, my friend. That's very sweet. Thank you for being here. I would just like to start also by acknowledging that I'm on Gadigal land. I'm in my office here at UTS. Please, if you get a bit distracted by what's behind me, that's just because my office is a reflection of the inside of my brain. So there we go. Today I'm talking to you, as Rachel said, the hidden histories of Australian popular music and culture. And to give you a bit of context, when I applied for the State Library visiting scholar position in 2024, I did so with one main idea. I wanted to dig into these things called street press, known as street press, which you can see on the screen. They're pre-digital media, and the reason I'm so interested in them, well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, because they are literally things that cannot be found elsewhere. They don't exist online. They don't exist in lots of other places beyond the State Library, and the State Library has incomplete holdings, although that has been completed some of that has been completed during the course of my visit. So I'm really, really happy and thrilled about that. But it's a part of Australian history, and in particular Sydney and New South Wales history, that really is unique and not understood. Importantly too, they're little time capsules that capture a version of Australian popular music and culture that did exist but has been forgotten about. A version that includes a lot more than, dare I say, the cliche of bands that are blokes, beer and rock and roll. So that's what I'm unpacking a bit to give you a sense of it. Also, to just let you know that where I can, I will be giving acknowledgements. Where I can't, often that's because there's things we still don't know about. So if you find something that I don't know, please let me know. I'm very, very open to that. Thank you. So I used to know how to drive PowerPoint. There we go. So for those of you that don't know, street press is kind of a pre-digital social media, is the way I explain it to students and to young people. Freely distributed from roughly the 1980s until the late 2000s. The thing about street press was it was weekly, it was free, and it was distributed occasionally via subscription and newsagents, but most of the time sent around to places where, dare I say it, fans would gather. So record stores, if you remember those, cafes, venues, really important. Now they're cheap, and this is an important thing to remember, they're cheap to access for fans, artists, and venues. And the reason I emphasize that cheapness is because I think that has had a bit of a flow on effect to their popularity at the time, but also their longevity going forward. To give you a little bit of a framework or how I've been thinking about these, I've been using work by Barker and Cantillon, who have done work on zines. Now, I don't know that I'd necessarily think of Street Press as a zine because even though they tended to be independent publications, they're a bit more organised than a zine. And often the types of publications I've been diving into on the street and drum media in particular really were a bit more organised and a bit more, had a longer life than a lot of zines do. But I like Baker and Cantillion's idea of them being a community archive, and that's what I've been leaning on. So, in particular, Street Press really, because it was free to distribute and it did attract ads, it did pay contributors, but it still had a community at its heart. Because there wasn't a back by a major record company or a major benefactor, a big kind of Murdoch-y type, it did mean that the community had to buy in, sometimes literally, but had to be involved ideologically as well as literally. So there really is a sense of community that was provided at the time. And what I'm hoping to find is, or I have found some as well, it really then reflects the community of the time. So it's quite a distinct kind of document for its time and a distinct then history that these artifacts hold. So for example, if we can compare street press to other types of press that you might know about. So street press is often called an indie, meaning independent or alternative press. Now, when we talk about that as well, it's important to think about alternative to traditional press. That's really or independent from traditional press, like I was saying. And I'm a popular music scholar by trade, so I'm leaning on Dave Hesminghaus and his sort of questioning of what does indie actually mean, or what does alternative mean. So whenever I'm talking about that, I think it's important to say alternative to what. Now, on the street and drum media, those kind of indie street presses were really alternatives to publications like you've got on the screen. The Sydney Morning Herald, Australian Rolling Stone. I haven't just put that up because that's a beautiful picture of David Bowie, but also, please enjoy. These were alternatives to these big mainstream titles. It's not to say that other titles weren't around featuring music, but if you think about the ways that we have revisited music and Australian popular culture history, it's through these big name traditional press outlets or specialist press outlets. Now, something to remember about these is that at the time and since, they've been relatively well heeled. And by that, I mean they had a lot of money happening for them as they're in production, a lot of money bought and traded on ads, quite high production value, quite high, I was going to say cachet, that's not what I mean, quite high respect as well. But on the other side, it meant the barrier to entry was quite high as well. If you're a band just starting out, if you're if you're a writer just starting out, if you're a photographer just starting out, these were not the places you were able to access immediately. At the same time, if you are a fan just starting out, or if you're somebody who's just getting into music or just getting into the community and the scene, these cost to engage in, these cost to buy, these cost to get to. And if there are any other little working class types like me, you might have stood in newsagents reading Rolling Stone for longer than you should have because you couldn't afford to buy it. You had to wait till next week's paycheck. So these traditional presses are really where people tend to go when they're thinking about doing music histories and popular music histories, but they did have barriers to entry and barriers to access. Now, those barriers continue, although it does mean that they're quite well heeled when it comes to places like the State Library. And of course they are, because the traditional press has also had lots of money to archive as well. So something like the Herald, of course, you can access in lots of different places. You don't even have to come into the library to get that. Increasingly now you can get whole pages for a while we went into Factiva land and you could only get text and not images. We've got everything layout, everything beautiful, easy to access. Rolling Stone and that type are not quite as well supported, but they're certainly well well preserved in a way that, well, street press hasn't been, and I argue needs to be. So like I said, street press is freely available, freely distributed, mostly free to fans and artists. Like I said, you could have a subscription if you wanted, if you're a bit hoity-toity, but much cheaper than the alternatives. What that means is the State Library's got some wonderful archives, the best in the country of street press in lots of ways. I did go to Canberra to check. There are a few things that Canberra holds that we don't, but overall we've got a very, very good collection. But the thing to remember is when you access these, because of the nature of the type of artifacts that they are and the type of money they did and didn't have behind them, even the archive and its worth is something that we're not engaging with perhaps in a way that we could. So anybody that's ever been anywhere near street press would know what I'm talking about on the left here with this image of my fingers up. It's what I call street press fingers. It's basically when you get the print of quite cheap newsprint on your fingers. Now, while that was very common for people, very common, if you know, you know, I have to admit when I was in the special collections, in special collections, flipping through thousands and thousands of issues as I did, I was a bit kind of struck by the fact that street press fingers are happening for what could be last national copies of things. So it did make me think, okay, we've got an artifact here that is fragile, but it's maybe not being considered, and its fragility is not being considered in the same way as other artifacts that we might consider that are also fragile, that might also come apart in your hands. I could just get in and have a look at it. Of course, the wonderful librarians were making sure I wasn't spilling coffee or doing anything like that, but it was just to be aware that because this is a free publication that was freely distributed, I wonder if we consider its worth. And I also wonder if that implication that they might be sort of worth less, or I don't mean worthless as in worth nothing, but worth less than other types of publications, is an ideology that persists. I do have to note here too a little bit of vandalism that I found in one of the issues. I did raise it with the librarian at the time, of course. Apparently, it's something, though, that was relatively frequent for a while in the collection, because people who were part of the street press who might have, featured, and that might be the only place they featured or the first time they featured, would just come in and help themselves. As you can see here, whoever was playing Under Funk by the Sea and Next to the Annandale just wanted to keep their own ad for themselves and not the rest of, well, not for the rest of our population. So it's something just to be aware of, that this is a collection that, despite not having had a lot of money put into its production and not having a lot of money put into its circulation and its preservation, I argue just because it was free doesn't mean it's worth less than other things, although perhaps we're yet to really catch up to its value. So what do we lose when we don't value street press? And I would argue that at the moment we don't quite value it in the way that we should, or the way that we could. What I think we lose are these things. We lose alternative voices, the literal and metaphoric voices that street press holds in a way that other publications didn't hold and still don't hold. We lose the legacies that started that could be maintained, celebrated, or emulated. And as I'll demonstrate with a few examples shortly, there are alternative versions of history that can be told by using these as sources, as opposed to sources like the Sydney Morning Herald or Rolling Stone. I also imagine there are people thinking, what about Duke? What about Go Set? There were lots of other mainstream publications, but if by focusing on these free ones, I think we can get a version of history that might be a version we don't really consider. Importantly, what I've noticed is street press had quite a high number of women who were participants, who were featured, who were running street press, and a couple of the street press I'm going to focus on for you today were led by women, which, again, is something that really not only blows my mind because of the achievements of what they were, but is a history that I feel like we could really benefit from hearing about, not just someone like me, but my students coming after me, my 7-year-old daughter coming after me, and my son for that matter, by really releasing these women who had such important contributions, we can learn a lot more about our histories. And we'll get alternative understandings of music, arts, and community cultural movements. So basically things that might not have been considered dare I say, newsworthy or valuable for big mainstream press that had big barons and big advertisers to answer to, we're actually getting alternative ways of thinking about things, things that were present that we might not know about in any other way. So just to give you a bit of context about this too, in case you're not a Australian pop music and culture nerd like I am, there are actually there are few existing histories of Australian popular music and local music, and these do tend to focus on men's contributions, even when apparently talking about women. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, with the acknowledgement that to get anything published about the Australian industry is actually really difficult. So I do really want to acknowledge that. But I think part of the reason that we get the same type of story is because publishers, for whatever reason, we kind of want a model of what worked before, and then we'll use it again. And that tends to be the same type of blokes in bands doing rock and roll stories. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is a section of a book that was released in late 2023 called Full Coverage, A History of Rock Journalism in Australia. And whenever something's called full, I mean, it's always a big ask, isn't it, to be covering everything. So I thought, oh, great, let's see how many women and how complete this story is. And what the writer has said is this, and I'll just read off the screen if that's okay. In early September 1990, Margaret Cott, editor of the influential street press On the Street, stormed into the office of publisher Noel Crabb and told him she was quitting. Tensions at the Free magazine had been growing for some time, but the reasons she walked outside are perhaps less interesting than what she found there. Waiting for her on the pavement was the entire editorial staff, writers Michael Smith and Jack Marks, photographer Tony Mott, along with a slew of others. Cott had built such loyalty in her near 10 years at the helm that her team quit in solidarity and decided to launch their own magazine. So this is an example, I would argue, of a version of history that focuses on men's contributions, even though the women were right there. So I've put in bold, so I'm drawing your attention to it, the fact that this author has emphasised the male staff rather than the female editor who actually led the walkout and who built something new. So this kind of lens, this uneven gendered lens, is something that I'm noticing in the mainstream, that I'm also wondering, why aren't we thinking about the fact that Margaret was the editor? Doesn't that trump these other positions? So it's just a little pattern that I've noticed, that I want to go back to source material, go back to On the Street, go back to this street press, and actually reconsider how we think about these things. So that was a publication that's been written after the fact. As part of my time at the State Library, I have, though, been able to dig into original source materials, and I'm finding that this kind of emphasis is happening, though, even as histories were being written in relatively short amount of time. So the quote that I've got here and the little piece I've got here is from On the Street's 300th anniversary issue from 1986. Now, at the time, and I apologise for the small little print here, I've pulled it out for you, but at the time, even though Margaret Cott was the editor and there was quite a mixed, gender mixed staff, the writer at the time, who was Mark Mildew, who's gone on to write quite a few of these types of histories, even then is kind of emphasising the men and their contributions. So again, if you don't mind me reading from the screen. Certainly one of the first striking impressions you get when you walk into On the Street these days is how much of the paper is powered by women. With a full-time staff starring Margaret Cott as editor, Shelley Rowe on advertising, Ellen Ellis on accounts, and Sharon O'Connell and Eloise McNulty as editorial assistants/office hands, it leaves layout and design artist Tim Skerritt heavily outnumbered, though he does have a minuscule office come cave top retreat where I usually like to berate him about not liking the Smiths. In an industry not exactly noted for its progressive attitudes to women, it's a notable achievement that On the Street is so very successfully run by so many of them, one that goes back to the days when I first started writing for the paper and Margaret did the design and worked with former editor Eleanor Boyd and advertising manager Catherine Armitage. So what's interesting here is that Mark is talking about and naming the women, but there's still an emphasis on the one man and where he sits and what he does. Now, again, I don't don't raise this as a way to criticize these individuals necessarily, but more to say there is, I guess, a normality or an acceptance that there's a gender hierarchy that comes with talking about these types of communities. And what I'd argue, though, is that it's artificial, because as we can even see on this page, by sheer numbers, there are more women than men here, and they're in higher positions, or arguably more, more influential positions. So that's kind of the imbalance that I wanted to start picking at. Also, too, very shamelessly, when I started reading a lot of this, I'm a popular music historian. I used to write for Street Press. That's my real love. The fact that names like Margaret Cott, Shelley Roy, Ellen Ellis, Sharon O'Connell, Eloise McNulty are people that I hadn't heard about as an apparent specialist was something I really felt I needed to fix. So I went about, as part of this this visit at the State Library, trying to find some of these hidden street press women. And it wasn't just people I wanted. I think sometimes when people think about popular music and culture, they think just about the people who are on the stage. I really thought, okay, so how is the rest of this being documented, and who else is contributing to this? So somebody like, and I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, Libby Blaney, who was one of the first illustrators and curators for On the Street. Eleanor Boyd, who was mentioned just there, a pioneering editor for On the Street. Margaret Cott, who is the editor-in-chief and a pioneering businesswoman for On the Street and Drum Media. One of the most important publishers this country's ever seen, I would argue, and still very not well known, very underknown. You know what I mean by that. Louise Dickinson, who is an editor and publisher of Lemon Magazine. Naomi Didden, who's a writer and founder of Loop Magazine, which was an electronic dance publication that's held in the State Library as well. And Mel Gregory, who's a booker and manager. So these are just some of the people that I've started to pull to interview as part of my stay, but also their work to sort of pull out and give back to them, and rediscuss, reconsider these hidden histories. Now, in order to do that, I've been digging into various forms of State Library holdings. And I just want to acknowledge here librarian Andrew Frost on the front desk, and he's also been in the Horn Room as one of the librarian helpers is not the right word. I'm sorry, Rachel. I know that's not the right word, but has helped us in the Horn Room as well. Bearing in mind that street press has often been hard to find, so hard, in fact, that it lives in other places. So On the Street, for example, started as a supplement for the Sydney City Express, and it was Andrew that suggested, why don't we go and have a look in the microfiche to see if some of that lives. So you've got on the left some of the hard copies, on the right some of the microfilm, and here we go. So you can see some of the ways that this material is being held, and it was a really big deal to find on the microfilm there on the right, because it was an issue that we thought just literally didn't exist anymore, had been wrapped up in fish and chips. And here it is in the State Library. Nobody knew it was there. So it's great to be able to find that. So let me spend some time now introducing you to some of these women that I found and their contributions and the way they've helped shape, at the time, the understanding of Australian popular music and culture. But I hope to, by unearthing them, how we can reconsider where we are now. So one of these people is Libby Blaney, who, again, I'd like to acknowledge another State Library librarian, Andy Carr, who noticed that Libby had donated a bunch of On the Streets. These previously were early issues that were thought to have been completely lost to time, thought that there weren't any national copies left. The Powerhouse held one of them and literally was behind glass with the big white gloves, the whole thing. It was very, very, very locked down. Andy noticed that Libby had donated a bunch of these and pushed through to get them accessioned quickly so that I could go through and have a look at them, but also helped connect me to Libby so that I could talk to her about these contributions. So these are issues from 1980. You can see, hopefully you can see, that what became a big kind of A3 paper started as a little pamphlet, and it was really, Libby was a one-person band. I was going to say a one-man band. Aren't we dominated by the way we speak? But Libby really put together what would become a very influential part of Australian popular music and culture. So I'm just going to flick through and give you a couple examples of some of Libby's work. Libby started off being commissioned basically to put together these pamphlets, you'll be able to see, though, that it wasn't just a piece of advertising. It really was about drawing the community in. It's a community archive. It's really reflecting energy and diversity. When I see these, even if you can't see on your screen quite clearly enough the names of the artists that are playing or the names of the venues, hopefully the energy is jumping out at you. And I think that's what really jumped out at me too. The colour and the movement that she's been able to embed just in these quite simple documents really give a sense of vibrancy to a scene that, you know, otherwise we wouldn't really know about. And names, you know, up here we can see places, names like Russell Morris and moving pictures might jump out at you. But as we go through, it kind of draws you in to want to know who was playing at the Bexley North Hotel, or, you know, who was playing in the Caringbah Inn. So it really kind of encourages you, even now, I think, to really dig in and to find out a bit more about the richness, not just the boys in the bands drinking beer, but what else was going on at the time. Now, as part of this work, I've had the opportunity to do an oral history with Libby, and I'll share a little bit of that with you now. If it's okay, though, I have I've transcribed it here for you rather than playing as audio. So Libby gave me this background into how she produced this work and what the context of it was. She said, I used to do artwork for Michael Chugg and Michael Gudinski. Oh, excuse me, I don't want to do that. When they decided to put things together, this information, they went to cafes and things, and they just asked me, would I do it? Would I put it together? And I foolishly said yes, because it was in those days, this was before computers, and so much of them were written by hand. So all information in it is handwritten pretty well. Once a week on a Wednesday night, I would sit up with my friend Peter Tillman, who was the singer of the Lipstick Killers. He and I would sit up, I would do all the cutting and drawing and everything, and he'd be my sort of support person. And about 3 in the morning when we'd finished, he'd drive me to Mortdale to a printer's there, and we'd drop it in at the printers, and it would be ready for the next afternoon. And there were people there waiting the next afternoon to take it round to cafes and shops where you'd pick it up. But there was no office. I did it all from my kitchen table. And I should acknowledge here too that even then, Libby's talking about having help and what supported her with Peter Tillman. It's a kind of acknowledgement chain that doesn't tend to happen in some of those other histories. So, you know, again, from a little kitchen table, we're getting things as vibrant and as engaging as this. Another woman I wanted to introduce you to, who I found in my travels, who's still missing. This is somebody I've not been able to find out more about. This woman's name is Vicky Land, and if you zoom in, you'll see, and I've put on the screen for you, she was the editor of On the Street in 1981. So at this time, again, very male-dominated industry, you've got an editor of this music publication. Now, there's very little that I can find about Vicky. There's not much else around about her. Again, this is a pre-Google time, so I can't just see if she's on LinkedIn or, you know, what her profile looks like. She's not there. You know, ring Vicky on a Monday or Tuesday gives us a little bit of a sense of the fact, again, that this was a very small operation that she was running, but she was getting this part of Australian history moving, and it was being run, you know, again, out of the sight of other places, kind of out of sight, maybe out of mind, but as we go back, really set up what become a really important legacy. Someone else that's missing as part of this, Eleanor Boyd and Lynn Walton, another name that appears in the beautiful State Library archive, but we know nothing else about, but was important enough to be one of two now. Eleanor Boyd and Lynn Walton are on the street. So these kind of jump out at me. Who were these people making these decisions that captured a version of history that wasn't being captured anywhere else? I really want to find out more about them. Now, Eleanor Boyd is somebody who I've been able to find out a little bit more about by Margaret Cott, and I mentioned to you Margaret before. I've relied where people have passed away. I have been able to find out that Eleanor has passed away, so I have been using the opportunity to try and gather oral histories to at least find out about people who've passed. So Margaret Cott, who succeeded Eleanor, explained Eleanor like this to me. She said, Ellie was a few years older, 7 or 8 years older than me, and maybe she just appeared that way. She was very rock and roll, very much rose tattoo, and knew just about everyone. I was always blown away that we would go to a gig, we'd go to see Split Enz or whoever it was, and everyone knew her. She was the rock and roll goddess. There was Ellie, and then there was another girl, Catherine Armitage. We were doing the paste up, the advertising, writing the copy, basically. She was really living the rock and roll lifestyle, and it all came unstuck for her. One moment she was working away, the next she was gone. She just left us holding the title. Now, the thing about this that really strikes me is obviously we're getting a secondhand history, but this is somebody who, again, as a specialist, I should know about. I know nothing about. Marg remembers and was, kind enough to explain to me. But I feel like, this part of history, to have so many women influencing each other is an important thing to have acknowledged, let alone unpacked a little bit more. And up until this point, I haven't seen a lot of it. I've got a little bit more from Margaret now, just in case you're wanting to know who she is. And Marg's still around. I'm still trying to talk her into coming and spending more time in the State Library. So if you see her on the street, just gently say we'd like to see her. Margaret went on to be the editor-in-chief and pioneering businesswoman for Street Press in New South Wales, but really set up a model that the rest of Australia used. So she started as a photographer, a bartender, and advertising. She was in advertising, and she was working for her father, who set up the Southern Highlands Gazette. So she is part of a bit of a dynasty. She took over from Eleanor and the Patricks, who were the owners of On the Street, even though they were owners only in name, and I can give you that story another time. And she built Drum Media in response to bad ownership. So you might remember that story that Jack Fell told in the Full Coverage book, where he talks about the walkout, but he emphasises the men that walked out. Well, Marg was the person that started the walkout, and then on the other end was the person who said, all right, what do we do now? And what they did was set up Drum Media, which went on to be even more successful, even more influential. And she set it up with her sister, Jenny Cott, who's also still around. This is a picture of Marg and Louise that I found in the Street Press. And interestingly, the story about how this was all put together is something that Marg has talked to me about, but is still a bit reluctant to have published. So I would ask, as part of this, that we kind of are aware of that. But she told me this story about setting up Drum Media. She said, I was still driving up and down from the Highlands and still working as a barmaid and doing socials for the local newspaper. By the way, socials in that context for the younger people here means social pictures, not social media. I secured a better editorial budget because I said I wouldn't do it unless I could pay everybody, and that's when things started to turn around. As soon as we really started to pay our writers, the editorial was better, the standard picked up, and a lot of young writers had been accepted by all the major press, and so I was getting great pieces from an array of different writers. I think the early lessons that you learn is that if you don't have diversity, then you don't have a grounded newspaper. And when you look at the last couple of issues I was working on, there are 106 pages printing 125,000 copies. That's pretty insane that was what was being made, 106 pages weekly. So it's a very big scale operation, something that I think too, because it was free, because it was around all the time, people forget the scale of what was being turned around by these sisters. It's really quite remarkable. I just want to introduce you to another couple of women before I move around and give you one more little case study. A couple other women that are held in the State Library. Their work is held in the State Library. Holding them in the State Library sounds a bit weird. They're not in a basement somewhere. Louise Dickinson, who was the editor and publisher of Lemon magazine, she actually started with Margaret on the street. Louise sadly passed away, but Marg has helped me piece together some of Louise's story, and here it is. Louise wrote an under 18 weekly column for On the Street. She loved writing and needed the money. I think the columnist back then got about $35 a week. I can't remember how long her column ran for, but wildly guessing about 8 months. She always made our deadline, even when she was working on her own. She was a good egg. I was very fond of her. Now, the reason that someone like Louise is important is because, again, it shows this lineage. It shows this influence of women supporting women in an industry that, in theory, is Beers and Boys and Rock and Roll. So Louise went on to make Lemon. Lemon was a very successful publication that circulated in the US, importantly, was featured in Tower Records and places like that. So from a little bedroom in Sydney was really doing great things. I mentioned too Naomi Didden, who was the writer and founder of Loop magazine, who actually started in drum media and worked with me as an RA on this project. Naomi's one of those people who's had a very important history and has contributed a lot to Australian popular culture and our understanding of it, but hasn't been encouraged to think about that contribution. So I've noted here that she was in the first series of Drum Media. And she tells a story about meeting Margaret, again, that lineage of how women supported women to enter into the market. And what she went on to contribute was this was a zine called Loop, and I think she'd be happy with me calling it a zine. It started off as Hallelujah, and then she went on and made Loop. Now, the important thing about Loop, and it is held in the State Library, I'm sorry, Rachel, I didn't put the call number up for this one, but I promise it's in there. The important thing about Loop is it was capturing a version of dance music that, again, I don't really think we still have thought about. So it's a genre that we don't really consider as being Australian necessarily. We've had a big contribution about, but it's all there in Naomi's pages. And you can have a look here at her description. But what I noticed so much at the end is she said, we tried to focus on Australian music, which, you know, is something that I think still we have an issue with in terms of how we think about popular culture, is really focusing on the local. So there's some other women that I'm still looking for. And if you've got any others, I'm shamelessly taking advice. I'm going to flash them up here slowly and then keep going. Just in my last few minutes, though, what I wanted to do is zoom in on a case study, a way that I've kind of tried to make sense of this huge, vast archive of street press and the stories we can use to tell, we can use it to help us tell. So there is a big, broader gender study, as you've already gathered by my chat so far. But what I've been using it to dig into as well is the story of even smaller communities. And I've started off with Naomi and also with a colleague, Dom Romeo, and a colleague, Greg Ferris, and a photographer, Brian Cook, to really unpack the story of the Hopetoun Hotel. Now, for those of you that know, if you know, you know, but the Hopetoun Hotel was a very vibrant music pub, particularly in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. And it's still standing, albeit dormant and, you know, borderline derelict. But the reason that I wanted to think about this and use the street press as a way to understand it was to really understand how this place became so important and what made it so successful, so that then we can look forward and say what might make a similar type of venue or a similar type of scene work today. So you can see here that I've surveyed about 375 issues of On the Street and 865 issues of drum media. Those that are good with maths will be able to add those together. So far, we've tracked 3,575 slots for music. By that, I mean opportunities for musicians to play. So 3,575 opportunities just in one venue. We've tracked from 1983 to 1995 so far. There's about the same amount again to analyse, but it's a very big job. But the point of this is to be able to say, in this one little hotel, based on what we can find out from this one source, street press, how can we understand what was going on and how we might emulate it going forward, how we might keep or revive a local scene. So the analysis looks something like this. People who are particularly skilled at Excel or Sheets, please don't judge me on my I only speak conversational spreadsheet. I apologise. I can ask for basic things, but I'm not real good at the complicated stuff. But what we've done, myself, Naomi and Dom and others have gone through and charted out, according to the ads in On the Street and Drum Media, the time that an artist would play, the month, the year, the day, the band name, then start thinking about genre, where they came from, the gender split, were they a headliner or not, and what did it cost? The reason we're doing this is to basically understand the community, to unpack this community archive. So let me give you some of our findings. First of all, what we've been able to find by going through with this process, using the street press as our core material to understand, is that Saturday night was the most popular night for music. That might not be surprising. But during this particularly vibrant time in Australian music history, in Sydney in particular, Wednesday night was was the second most important night, the night when music happened most often. Now, that surprised me, I have to admit. I thought midweek socials was a new thing, but it's not. So it's something to kind of consider, that at a time in a venue that was very, very important, thinking about how it made its way, basically. And so this is some of the things we've been able to find. Friday night was kind of okay. Sunday night was kind of okay. But really, Saturday and Wednesdays was the times for peak performance. We've also been able to find out when was the place most active, when was there the most opportunity for audience and artists to play. And 1992 comes up, 91, 92, which is an important thing to think about if you again think about when we talk about Australian music history, or when we might think about pop music and when things have endured. At the moment, I can feel a bit of a 90s resurgence, and I tended to sort of think maybe it's just I'm a person of a certain age rethinking my youth. But we've been able to see, using this source data, using the street press as our guide, that there really was more music happening at that time. Now, I do need to note that the on-the-street holdings in particular are not quite as complete for in the 80s, so that could contribute to our stats being a little bit down there. But it is giving us something to work with, nostalgia versus actual data, if you like. Something else we were able to unpick is where artists were coming from. So if you're thinking about, you know, how something is successful, or what kind of, what the scene was made up of, we found that unsurprisingly, perhaps the majority of artists were from Sydney. A bunch of them were not found, and this not found category is important because, well, for starters, as I said earlier on, we've got hidden histories that live in the street press. There are musicians and bands who may have only played one or two gigs and then never again, or may have played and then were not famous enough, or well-heeled enough to be able to afford to advertise in the Herald, to be on the record in that way, or to be able to get the notice of a big enough record company to get into Rolling Stone in that way. So we've got a bunch of artists that, are in the street press, but we weren't able to locate them in much other ways, certainly much about where they came from. So Sydney was the first one, then Melbourne, Brisbane and Canberra. What's interesting, though, too, is that as we've done some qualitative analysis as well as quantitative, so started to talk to artists who were playing at the Hopetoun, this is a bit out of whack. So lots of people said to us, we're not from Sydney, even though when we analysed the ads, we found the majority of people were. And then anecdotally, those that were more famous had come from other places. So people like Tex Perkins, the Foiling Joys, the Clouds, Powderfinger, Custard, they were from other places. So the ones that came from other places but played here have tended to be more successful in some ways. So it's a little bit of data we can use to start pulling at a thread and finding some other things. Importantly, too, as we were analysing the ads, we started to think about what does it mean to have special events or not. And this pub most often just ran gigs on the ordinary. They weren't terribly special, although there were a few things they did. So where I've got a Y, there were 509 out of 3,575 gig slots. 509 of them were special, marked as special somehow, a single launch, an album launch, public holiday. This pub had something in particular called Rock Against Work, which was a special event that happened on a Tuesday afternoon, which I can talk to you about in more detail if you're interested. But it was about how to get people into the community, what drew them to the community. And overwhelmingly, we found it wasn't anything special. People just turned up because they like to turn up, which I think is something that's really telling, and perhaps counter to what you might think about if you were just guessing. In terms of artist gender, well, we did find that there was predominantly identifiably male-based artists, although again, you see that not found coming up as the second most popular finding there. And the process of finding was we'd look at a band name, Naomi in particular would look at a band name, then go down a rabbit hole of Discogs and other places where we might expect to find band biographies. So by having a not found, again, like I said, we've got that kind of issue of, were they bands that didn't come up before or that weren't big enough for long enough to be on the record? Were they mixed, or were they not considered important enough to capture, and that mixed category and that female category, as you'll see underneath, they're identifiable. Mixed, we mean mixed gender or mixed in genre ways as well. So it's something to think about, though, that we've got a proportion, a big group of people who played that are not on the record yet. So what can we do about that? The cost is really important to let you know as well. Majority of stuff was free. Majority. 3 gigs that were $6 each. There you go. That didn't go so well. But that's something else we've been able to find just by tracking these ads. And finally, in terms of genre and how we might think about who was playing at the time, again, this is something that the existing history versus what we've actually been able to find in the street press is a bit of a gap, because using that method of going through Discogs or books or other things to be able to help us out, rock and indie rock and pop were the terms that were coming up most now, and Naomi's process was to look something up and then see what the genre lives like now. There's a lot of not found. And what we did find, though, too, in tracking all of these, we had 153 different genre values or different genre names that were coming up, even using this contemporary process. So it's given us more to do. It's let us know that rock is a dominant descriptor, certainly now, but 153 unique values suggest to us that a lot of different stuff was going on at the time, and there's a lot more for us to capture. So still to do. The rest of the spreadsheet, the rest of the history, just of this little pub. We've got a lot more to do, a lot more of the not found to find. There's also accidental and artistically deliberate mistakes. I call it the Tex Perkins problem, because artists like Tex Perkins would deliberately use different names, and lots of bands would do that in a pub like the Hopeton when they became too big to attract too much attention. They'd use a different name so they could still play somewhere they like to, local in the community, and not overwhelm the place. So what's happening, and I'm just about to finish here, Rachel, is we're putting this together for a book, and part of the State Library's collection has been incorporating these ads to help us flesh out the story and confirm the story. So, for example, here is a story about an annual event that the Hopeton held in various ways over Christmas. This one was Camels by Candlelight, but they had lots of different ones. There's lots of oral histories and things we can find. Brian's beautiful pictures illustrate us here, but by being able to go back to drum media in the State Library's collection and capture it, we can find out exactly who played, when they played, and all those lost little gems we can confirm. Same with the Tex Perkins problems, as I said, where somebody will say, I think he played with this, I think this was the name, I think it was this pub or that pub. We can go back and actually find out. And we can also present these beautiful artefacts as actual pieces of art themselves. And just this morning, I got a lead about who the artist was that did some of this early artwork, and it's another lost woman. So until I can confirm her, I can't give you her name, but there's more and more of these lost things coming out. So the big questions that remain: how to impose order on all this stuff there is. I'm alphabetical, chronological, autobiographical is a joke that you'll get if you know Nick Hornby. Where and how to put this and in what format, what to do with it, and what I should do and acknowledge in acknowledging to my relationship to some of this content, having worked in some of this for a while, having been a punter and a fan. And if you want to know more about the Hoey stuff, it's there at Spirits of the Hoey, but there's so much more to find. Thank you for your time and your attention. Sorry, Rachel, I did do a little bit more than I was expecting, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you all so much.
That's so great, Liz. That's a phenomenal amount of work. And as someone who only speaks conversational Excel myself, it is still a very fine spreadsheet indeed. So I've got a few comments and a few questions coming through. If you have anything you would like to ask Liz, now is your moment. A couple of people are reminiscing. I did not know this. Crow's Nest was an important music venue. Who knew? Really? Crow's Nest?
Well, this is the beautiful thing. And I'd really encourage people to go and have a look at the On the Streets, those early ones, Libby's beautiful work. Just the sheer number of venues is astonishing, absolutely astonishing, the choice. So when people say, oh, there was more back in the day, well, literally, you can count them. It's incredible, yeah.
A lot of people are saying that Wednesdays are still very important to them. Possibly a little bit younger than either of us. That's completely fine. someone has been taken back to the 90s and the explosion of cover bands and seeing all those sorts of bands in the types of venues um, that you described. A few people are teary that the Hopeton isn't a thing anymore. Um, yeah, even if you crowdfunded, I don't think you'd be able to get that venue back up and running. We also have a couple of questions. This is an interesting one. So you've spoken a lot this morning about gender and these women that were going out and doing pretty amazing slash kind of feisty stuff. Um, you did mention one woman in particular, everybody knew her. So how does that sort of networking take place in an environment and an industry that doesn't exactly warmly welcome women or acknowledge them easily? Is that like a hereditary? Did she have an entree card into this industry, or did she just say, okay, I am here and I want to know all the people? How does that work?
Well, I think, and if that's a reference to that quote about Eleanor Boyd, I think, well, it's a couple of things because what I'm finding, and you may be some of those people, if people that are in the industry do actually know each other. Of course, we know each other. It's just that those that are remembered don't tend to be the women. Those that are written about don't tend to be the women. The women have always been there. And I guess that's what has been really affirming and interesting and humbling about digging through the street press is to see the women are there. They've always been there. And I know that myself when I was at the Hopeton and those other places. We saw each other, we knew each other. But then when the histories were written and when the books were written and the publications went up, they weren't there anymore or in the same way. And sometimes it had to do with the types of jobs that people had. So not a lot of work has been written on the male publishers either, if I'm honest. You know what I mean? Like it
Okay.
was the types of jobs that people had. So I think about people like Stuart Coupe, or I think about people like Michael Smith, or I think about people who was also one of those iconic first people at Drum Media, people who were very prolific. Their histories haven't been written either. So maybe it's got to do with the type of work that you had. But I think too, like I said, it was that process of remembering each other as well. So even someone like Margaret, who again I adore and desperately want her to write her autobiography and I'm very aware of not telling her story for her because
Yeah.
she's still around, but it's about how do we get people who are known or were known um to pursue that, you know what I mean? And some people quite rightly want to disappear, and that's fine, and we found that certainly in the Hopeton project. I mixed a lot of the archival work with oral histories and said to people, I found this reference, I found this gig, could you tell me about it? There were men and women who said, no, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to revisit that. I want that left in history. And that's a wicked problem that historians have all the time. You know what I mean? I think you don't want to go and literally cut it out of the newspaper like someone had done in that on the street. But you do, I think it's important to respect how if people want to shape their history, I think they've got the right to do that. So anyway, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point about the jobs are not necessarily considered as important or as critical, but that's kind of counterintuitive because if these people aren't documenting the gigs, I mean, yes, there's word of mouth,
Yeah.
but surely there wouldn't have been as many people attending these things. I mean, and if you're in Surrey Hills, you're not going to know anything is happening out at Crow's Nest unless somebody actually tells you or you read about it. Do you have
Yeah.
any ideas as to why that's not part? Is it just not as sexy as the people up on stage?
Well, look, partly that, but also I think the idea is we've done that. You know what I mean? So when there are stories about and I do think about, say, someone like Stuart Coupe, who is an editor and still very active in the music industry. He's written his biography not too long ago. Um, I think then publishers think, all right, we've done that. We don't need another one. You know what I mean? And so it's who gets there first, and then what's the point of difference? And particularly within the street press, when I read through, and I didn't notice it myself until I really started looking. I worked for years and read many more years before than I was in before I realised how many women's names I could see. because it was just the genre. It wasn't women's history or women's music.
Yeah.
It was just music where there was equal or pretty good representation. Like we're still seeing it's about a third to two-thirds in terms of participation, but that's much better than it is at the moment. You know what I mean? So we really did have, just a community that was made up, that was very diverse, that I would argue one of the values of looking back is to be able to say, if it's gotten a bit broken, how do we fix it again? Like, what can we learn?
Yeah.
Like all historians, right? What can we learn from the past so that we can do the future better?
We only have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to squash in one last question. You talked a bit in your introduction about the indie press and, sort of a response to the more traditional, more expensive and lucrative press. Did the traditional press have an opinion that they voiced about these independent publishers, or did they just think it was all too small to worry about?
Oh no, I'm pretty sure they definitely used them as onboarding. You know what I mean? So they were
Oh,
it
okay.
was absolutely the unofficial training ground for people who went on to work in those higher tier, or however you want to call them, more expensive, more lucrative, better um, considered press. And so what's interesting is when you go through the street press, the number of people in film, you'd call it juvenilia, the
Yeah,
very early things that people do in their career. It's all there in the street press. Somebody's first photo, Tony Mott, for example, started at Drum Media, who, had that wonderful exhibition and is a big part of the State Library's collection, arguably Australia's most famous popular music photographer started in the street press, and it's someone like Margaret who gave him a go. You know what I
yeah.
mean? So really, what it was, that onboarding process, where perhaps these days it happens online, perhaps these days, it's a DIY in another way, but certainly I think those bigger publications were looking to what people could produce for free, for less,
Mm.
to be able to show a proof of concept.
It's a great story and lots more to come. So we'll watch out for the book and all the other bits and pieces that you share with
Spreadsheets.
us over time. Spreadsheets. Maybe don't share the spreadsheets. We just need the pretty bit at the end. Um, Please, everybody that's around today, it's almost the end of the year, as much as I hate to say that, but do join us here on site at the library for the biennial Coral Thomas Lecture. We will announce all of the fellows and their exciting projects for 2026. So that is here at the library in the auditorium on the 22nd of October at 6 p.m. And you can go to our website and you can book a ticket. You can also book a ticket for the last Fellows Forum for the year. We have a panel event. We're going to be talking about how do you tell a history that most people has just assumed has already been told. Oh no, we don't need to learn anything more about the Opera House or Louisa Lawson or anybody else for that matter, because we've already heard them. Hear from our fellows talking about their new angles and how histories have occasionally been mistold. Fake news. Who knew? And of course, the last fellows' findings for the year will be online on the 4th of November, and Dr. Chi Chi Wang, who is one of our Nancy Keesing Fellows, will be talking about the slow acceptance of traditional Chinese medicine in Western practices here in Australia, and how Australian doctors had to acknowledge Chinese medicine for simple things like contraindications, and also because some of it, shock, actually worked. So come and hear about her research online. So for those things that are on site only and online only, everything is on our website. You can go to What's Happening and search by fellows, and you can also see some other great stuff happening here at the library. Until then, thank you everybody for your company this morning. Stay curious, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, Liz.